As we saw in a previous video, production centers and CenterPoint for agriculture represent the area where production occurs. So for crop farmers, that location or area might be a particular field or a particular farm where the production occurs. For a livestock producer, that might mean a particular confinement building or confinement area for the livestock. They're an optional management piece of information, and several of our customers like to track all of their revenue and expenses all the way down to the actual physical location where each production occurs. Sometimes they want to do that for a profit analysis of that area of the business, but sometimes it's just for looking at the costs associated with that area of the business. Production centers themselves are used in transactions. So in a transaction, you would go ahead and if you have an expense, you would divide that expense out to the different locations that that expense is for, or the different production centers that that expense is for. Production center groups are not used in a transaction. Instead, they're used for filtering and for reporting purposes. In order to have production center groups, we first have to have production centers. To get to production centers, we go to Setup, Profit and Production Centers, and then to Production Centers. You can see here for my company, I have several production centers here. Now, most of these production centers are crop production centers, and they represent fields where we grow some different crops. The last two on the list, though, are livestock production centers, and they represent just confinement areas for our livestock. So I may have certain situations where I want to group these together. For example, every time I need to filter for just my crop production centers, I'm having to select all of these production centers and then exclude these last two. It would be a lot easier if I could put them in a group and just select the group. Another thing that is a common question that gets asked by producers is, can I take and group together my production centers or my fields that represent a particular farm? Production center groups is a way to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of here. And then we're going to go ahead and set up some production center groups to do some of that. To do that, we're going to go to Setup. We're going to go to Profit and Production Centers, and then Production Center Groups. Okay, to create a new production center group, I'm going to go ahead and click New. So the first two production center groups that I'm going to set up is one for crop and one for livestock. So I'm going to click New here. I'm going to go ahead and create my first one, and I'll call these Crop Production Centers. And then when I go to select a type, you do need to either say, what kind of type it is. Most of them for our agriculture customers would be either crop or livestock or some other type of production center. As soon as you select the type, the box down here on the bottom left here will go ahead and be filled with those production centers that match that type. So these are all my crop production centers. So I could move all of them over to the right and then go ahead and click the Save button. Okay, then I could go ahead and click New again. And I'm going to go ahead and create my livestock production centers. And in this case, the type is going to be livestock, and it'll fill that box down here at the bottom with just the livestock production centers. So I can move them over there and click Save. Now that makes it really easy for me to separate out my livestock production centers from my crop production centers. But I might also have the need to separate my different fields out by what farm they are. So I could create additional production center groups for each farm. So I have a farm called the Harvey Farm. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the Harvey Farm here. And that farm is made up of a couple different fields. Those are all crop types of production centers. And it's actually made up of just 2 fields here. So it's this field and this field right there. And all I have to do is move those over. Now, this Harvey field and the Harvey 85 and the Harvey North field were already part of my production center group called crop. So you can see here, you can make a individual production center be a member of more than one group. Now, production center groups can be deleted at any time because they are not used in a transaction. They are just used, like I said, for filtering different production centers. And by doing, allows you to do comparisons side by side. So another thing that I get asked often is a lot of customers want to be able to do an analysis of their owned fields versus their rented fields. So you could go ahead and create a production center here for owned fields. And it's going to also be a crop type of production center group. And I could grab all of the fields that my company owns. So I could grab all of those fields, move them over to the right-hand side, and then create a separate group for rented fields. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and grab all of the ones that are members of that rented field group there. Okay, and we're going to move those over to the right. Now I can do a comparison of owned fields versus rented fields. And you could do that on an income statement. You can do separate columns for owned fields versus rented fields, but you can also do that kind of comparison in an area of our program called production analysis. Since these are not used in transactions, you might want to go ahead and delay creating production center groups until you actually need them. I'm going to close out of there and I'm going to go ahead and bring up reports. And I'm going to just go ahead and open up the financial statements area here and select a income statement report. Now, on several different reports, you're going to see the ability to filter those reports by specific production centers like I have here. Well, in order to capture those that were my owned fields, for example, I would have to go ahead and make sure that I selected the 3 that were actually my owned fields, and then move those over to the right-hand side and click OK. So if you have lots of, let's say you had set up your production centers or you wanted to see, different fields, you have to select production centers kind of one at a time there in order to get the ones you want. Okay, so this means I have to select all 3 of those. It would be a lot easier if I could just select the production center group. So you notice down here, I'm going to clear that. I'm going to get rid of those that I had just selected underneath the production center. But you notice right below there, I actually have one for the production center group, which would allow me to quickly just grab my own fields. Okay, so all I would have to do is go ahead and select the own fields, and then it would actually grab all 3 of those fields because they're all members of that group. Okay, so that makes it a lot easier to go ahead and filter them. Now, if you don't have a filter like that on your list of reports, then down here in the More Items button, there may be a filter for production center groups. So what you would want to do is you would want to find it in this list, and then you'd want to go ahead and put a check mark into it. Okay, and then these buttons on the right-hand side, as you highlight that item that you just added, like production center groups, you can also control where it appears on your list of filters over on the right-hand side there by going ahead and moving it up or down on the list. So I've moved it right below Production Center. So I'm going to click OK. And now it makes it easy for me to go ahead and select those owned fields. Okay, so filtering is only one of the things that you can do with Production Center groups. Like I said, there is the ability to run an income statement and have separate columns by Production Center groups. We can see that here in the income statement. There's also an item called Fill Columns With, and I could say Fill Columns With Production Center groups. That would give me the ability to go ahead and do an analysis of owned versus rented fields. Okay, and then there's an area of the program called production analysis, which would also let me see owned versus rented fields, or crop production centers versus livestock production centers. And if I had production center groups set up for different farms, it would allow me to take all of the fields for one farm and see them together.